Hello, this is Amanda Teely for English 2 presentation on Native American and white relations throughout history. I was really intrigued through reading the book Killing Custer and our other assignments how the Indians were treated throughout time, and so I thought I'd look a little bit more into that. Before the Western movement, the Indians were sovereign. They're very strong militarily and numerically. They were economically self-reliant, grew all their own food, made all of their own tools, hunted, lived off the land. When the Europeans started to arrive in the U.S. in the 1600s, there was equality. They had friendly relations and treated Indians with respect. At first, they created trading partnerships and alliances. The Europeans even recognized the prior right of Indians to the land. And in a really interesting book I found, The Native American Almanac by Arlene Hirschfelder and Martha Cripe de Montano, they quote, or here's a quote from the book: "In almost every instance, first arrivals to North America were received with hospitality. From the beginning, however, English colonists pressured Indians to adopt the so-called civilized European lifestyle and Christianity, and often employed repressive measures to overpower Indians who did not comply." So the beginning of the Indians not being treated well. During the Revolutionary era, the Indians found themselves aligning with the British. They tended to treat them more fairly, and they had better benefits. They could provide them more than the settlers of America. Many of their homelands were destroyed in the fighting, and so they were forced elsewhere. And in the Treaty of Paris, British granted Americans title to the entire Northwest Territory, disregarding any tribal land for what was previously the Indians. After the Revolution, settlers poured onto the Indian lands, ignoring the Indian rights of what was theirs before. Early United States laws recognized Indians' right to their land, which could not be taken without their consent. But the settlers they didn't really care what the law was. The government actively encouraged Indians to adopt white technology and culture, which was the beginning of the assimilation process to make them more cultured or civilized. This also was the beginning of the Indian Intercourse Acts, which was several acts that would govern trading practices. In 1775, federal Indian policy created 3 departments, the Northern, Middle, and Southern, that would oversee all of the Indians. Each was led by a commissioner who reported directly to Congress. They were responsible for winning the support of the Indian nations. And in a lot of my reading, I found that it was to any extent, which included lying, cheating, manipulating. and also continued the removal and assimilation process. In the 1820s, they started moving natives west to continue the efforts of the civilization program. They were expected to become farmers and then integrate into the white society. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act by President Andrew Jackson was set in place. Forcible removal of Indians from their land in eastern United States to land west of the Mississippi was what this Indian Removal Act did. And many of us are aware from our history books growing up. The Trail of Tears was a part of this Removal Act. 18,000 Cherokees were forced from their land into southeast United States to what is now Oklahoma. And throughout the entire time of the removal process, over 100,000 Indians were removed from their homes. And here starts the Western movement when settlers now are wanting to move west of the Mississippi. And this really starts a lot of the very bloody massacres, including the Battle at Little Bighorn. There were actually so many battles and massacres that it's impossible for me to name them all. Some of the reasons that the settlers expanded west was for the gold rush and to try to gain farming land. They continued to force Indians off their land and onto reservations. And during this time, they nearly wiped out the buffalo herds and depleted the resources for making it difficult for the Indians to live off the land. In this time, Indians were forced onto reservations or very strongly encouraged onto reservations. In 1971, the federal government began treating Indians as wards and the government as their guardian. And I find this interesting that they actually forced the Indians to be dependent on the government. Indian agents distributed annuity goods, food rations, and supplies, but many of those agents were corrupt, and the reservations ended up getting spoiled food for the Indians, and they skimmed money off the top. The assimilation process started around the late 1870s when the Indian children were placed in federal boarding schools. They were stripped of their native clothing and hair, forced to speak English instead of their native languages, subjected to militaristic discipline, and were given Christian training. On the reservations, Indian religious practices were outlawed and were punished by removal of their rations to live off of. And missionaries were sent to the reservations. Termination was when the Indian problem needed to be solved, and they did this by ending the relationship between the Indians and the federal government. So what had happened is those government agents, the Indian agents, were becoming corrupt again, and they needed to take care of the problem. In 1953, the BIA identified about 100 tribes that they thought could sustain themselves without government assistance and terminated the relationship with the federal government. One of those included the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin. All federal programs were cut, and they then became subject to taxation of their lands, so something they were not used to. This didn't seem to work, and most were reinstated in the following 20 years. Self-determination was an act that President Nixon put into Congress in 1970, and this is actually still the law today. No tribe would be terminated without its consent. Tribal governments would be encouraged to take over federally funded programs for their benefit, and the tribes would be helped to become economically self-sufficient. Like I said, this still is the law today. And on a side note, in 1973, Nixon also reinstated the Menominee Reservation. This is actually a photo of myself as an officer on the Menominee Reservation.